I didn't see the bulletin, and so I didn't know that the part of Isaiah that I'm talking about is not in the reading. So, the part of Isaiah has been truncated, and the hard part is left out, but I'm going to talk about the hard part. So that's what I'm doing if you think, what is she talking about? Sorry about that. 3 weeks ago, a brave and holy man shuffled off his mortal coil and passed into the mystery of eternity. His name was Dr. Charles Willey, a black professor of sociology whose research and work were in the areas of desegregation, higher education, public health, race relations, urban community development, and family life. He was the author or editor of 100 articles and 30 books on those issues. Charles Willey was the grandson of slaves, the son of a Pullman conductor, and the son of the first black woman to graduate college in Texas. And Charles Willey was an Episcopalian, the first black person in 1970 to be elected to the House of Deputies of the Episcopal Church. In 1970, the church was as racially segregated as a church can be and still call itself a church. I will return to his story in a minute and to my awe of him, but I need to give you some background about why I chose to tell you this story today. Because when we meet Isaiah today, it is 742 BCE, 742 years before the time of Jesus, and Isaiah is having the seminal experience in his life. He is seeing God, whether actually or in a vision, it doesn't matter, because those were the same things to all people in those days. The vision or the seeing is so powerful, so vivid, so mind-blowing, that he is struck down speechless. God is so completely other, so absolutely powerful, so clearly and unequivocally sovereign, that Isaiah can't find anything familiar, can't see anything he recognizes. But what is also happening to Isaiah and to the Israelites in 742 is that their king of 40 years, Uzziah, has died, leaving his son, probably not the best person for the job, on the throne. The most pressing issue of the day was the westward expansion toward Palestine and Syria. To understand the degree of terror in the hearts of the Israelites, you have to think about the people on the border of Ukraine today. Or you have to think about the people of Poland between Russia and Germany in 1939. The threat was enormous. Isaiah's job as the prophet of God, for which he volunteered after his vision, and I don't know if we could use the word volunteer when God is saying, "Whom shall we send?" But it might have helped Isaiah feel better if he thought of himself as a volunteer. Because what happens next, and this is the part that we didn't read, is very, very difficult to take. God tells Isaiah to let the Israelites know that God intends to exterminate them. Presumably in the coming invasion of Assyria, because they have wandered so far from their covenant with God. Isaiah explains this. In book 5 he says, "For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. He loves these people. God expected justice, but he saw bloodshed. He expected righteousness, but he heard a cry." God is concerned with social justice, with right relationships, with promise-keeping, and Israel had failed. And so it is Isaiah's job, and can you imagine figuring out that you had volunteered for this, to tell Israel that God is going to use Assyria to punish them. In chapter 10, God will say, "Ah, Assyria, I send him against a godless nation. I dispatch him against the people who anger me, to trample them down like mud in the streets. Well, God also says that when the job is finished, he's going to take care of Assyria, but that's no consolation to Israel. However, I want you to hear that in the very last line of the reading, what we hear is, the holy seed is in the stump. The holy seed is in the stump. There will be redemption after all that destruction. The spark of God's life remains no matter what. Israel will not die. So here, in this story, is a frightening and wonderful belief about our relationship with God. God's ways are not our ways. God's ways are not predictable, but they are always and forever in the service of the renewal of creation. We don't take this to mean that God metes out punishment when God is offended. We would understand that God allows the course of our behavior to have its impact, because we are not objects of God's whims. We are partners in the continuous creation and redemption of the universe. And sometimes that continuous creation and redemption demands that we take bold stands against the established order of things. In 1970, the Episcopal Church did not ordain women to the priesthood. In 1970, the General Convention of the Episcopal Church approved the ordination of women to the diaconate, but not to the priesthood and certainly not to the episcopacy. There was so much hope, though, that the issue was even being discussed, that there was an idea that the resolution might pass at the next convention in 1973. In fact, in 1973, the resolution passed the House of Bishops, but not the House of Deputies. In the House of Deputies, the resolution had had a majority of yes votes, but a quirk of the voting system, this is maybe starting to sound familiar to you, the quirk of the voting system meant that all split votes went to the no vote. Hardly democratic. So in 1974, 11 brave women who believed that the exclusion of women from the priesthood was unjust, to say the least, were ordained at the Church of the Advocate in Philadelphia to force the issue. Charles Willey was the preacher. Charles Willey was then vice president of the House of Deputies. He chose to participate in this ordination, and you have to understand that was a brave, bold move. Because, he said, he could not remain silent. He said, I speak as a child of God who has decided to make no peace with oppression. The House of Bishops invalidated the ordination of these women. Dr. Willey resigned from his position in the House of Deputies, which was certainly a terrible loss for the church, but it was entirely consistent with his ethics. He said later that he could not act like Pilate and do what he knew was wrong. Michael Curry, our presiding bishop, has said that for that, Dr. Willey was a profile in courage. So here's my question to me and to you. How did this man, this bright, far-seeing, righteous black man, do what he did? Just try to think about this. A man whose grandparents had been enslaved, overcoming what we know now is generational trauma for the black people in this country. How did he do all that and do all those remarkable things? Charles Willey must have understood the last line of Isaiah. The holy seed is in the stump. In every burned out, rotten tree stump, there is a seed of new life, of redemption, that no matter how desperately bad we know things to be, it is within us to choose love. Jesus, having filled Peter's boat and other boats with fish, said that same thing to Peter, who was having an Isaiah experience. Peter recognizes the presence of the Holy One, like Isaiah, and is overwhelmed. But Jesus said, don't worry. Don't worry. Become a fisher of people. Love people as Jesus loved him. We are given the prophets and saints to help us imagine what it would take for us to stand for justice, to act righteously, to choose love. Charles Willie has been given to us in our own church as a sign of God's ceaseless development of the holy seed in the burned out snow. But more than that, he stands on the shoulders of all those people who have suffered so grievously and so needlessly. People whose lives we honor and from whom we ask forgiveness this month. Let us join with the presiding bishop and the whole church to give thanks for the life of this good man whose courage and conviction have blessed us all.